This is What in the World is Going On. I am your host, Richard Shoff. Program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes of Kannapolis. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and here only by the grace of God for this broadcast. Well, I know what's on many minds is what just happened over in Singapore. Let's talk about it. Did you know that not any president in our history has talked with a leader of North Korea since the Korean War? And did you also know that that war is officially still on? We never signed an end to it. It's just a temporary, we're not shooting, I guess. But Donald Trump went over and met with him. Boy, he was sure criticized. But you see, it was a matter of, are we going to talk or are we going to have a war? Maybe a nuclear war. Many very knowledgeable people feel that North Korea is a bigger potential threat than China, Russia, even Iran. You see, the ruler over there is a nutcase. I think that's pretty well proven. He's certainly ruthless. He kills members of his own family. And he had promised to nuke our troops in Guam. He has missiles that even now, I understand, would reach not only Guam but also Hawaii, Alaska. He has intercontinental missiles that will, I believe, reach the U.S. He's just got to get nuclear warheads on them, and he could nuke any place in the United States. Seoul's only 35 miles away from the DMZ. I don't know how many million people are down there. Could be easily overrun. 35 miles away. This is a very dangerous situation, folks. Well, our president prepared to go over, and boy, did he get criticized. First off, he got criticized, for not being prepared. Well, he had weeks of preparation. In fact, if you remember back a few weekends ago, he was out at Camp David, and Secretary of State Pompeo was supposed to meet with him for bringing him up to speed, and Pompeo said, hey, he's all up to speed. He canceled it. Said it wasn't necessary. The president was well informed. Well, our very biased press pointed out some sentence where Trump had said something about he didn't need to prepare. Well, his not needing to prepare, they left off the sentence before it, was because he'd already been prepared. He'd already been indoctrinated. You see, it was a team effort. Pompeo had been to North Korea twice, met with Kim. John Bolton was there. He's got years as UN, our ambassador at the United Nations. Someone noted that having him on the team is like having an aircraft sitting offshore. Sure, Trump had a different way of going about it. Kind of glad no leader had met with him for 30 years. I'm glad he was doing something different. You see, Trump's a fairly successful businessman. He's been in it all his life. I don't think he's made too many mistakes. At least the smart moves have outnumbered them. He's negotiating in his own way as he did as a businessman, not as a politician. I guess that's what the American people wanted when they put a businessman in the White House. Maybe they were kind of sick of politicians. So many of the people that were criticizing him are unknowledgeable people. After he got over there, Trump was criticized for meeting with him, shaking his hand, getting a picture taken. Hey, before he went over, this is a side note, but he was even criticized for meeting with Kim Kardashian when Kim Kardashian was making an appeal for clemency for Alice Marie Johnson. Now, you'd have thought the liberals would have loved that. It was a black grandmother, but sentenced to life imprisonment for a nonviolent first offender crime. I guess she'd done 20 years or something for a drug charge. Well, Trump gave her clemency. Boy, oh boy, did that upset everybody because he didn't know what he was doing. Wow. Anyway, Trump made it over. He gave us something that nobody had given us in 60 years. The keys to Trump's success in North Korea, writing from Karen McQuillan came across my desk. I'm going to refer from it some. But anyway, who'd have thought that a real estate developer from New York City, who was famous for plastering his name in big letters on his building, who would have thought he'd be a champion in foreign policy? Big surprise, folks. Turns out that being confident, tough, and aggressive works well for a president dealing with a dangerous pipsqueak, one like ISIS or North Korea. But you see, Trump isn't intimidated by anybody. Not intimidated by business rivals or critics, not by rogue FBI agents, not by foreign leaders, certainly not by failed experts who urge weakness, meekness, caution, and limited goals. Our president is devoted to one thing, folks: winning for America. Now, he does listen to our military and work with its members. They've helped. He does understand power works. Korea could thumb its nose at us because it was protected by China. So, first Trump had to remove that protection by going after China. Trade pressure on China was a prerequisite to movement on Korea. Our expert diplomats and analysts still don't talk about this big picture. But Trump is obviously a strategic thinker. Well, you have to be in the business world as you do to be in the military. He got criticized for that flap on the communist outfit ZTE. Well, let me just give you a little something that wasn't in the mainline media. The president of China called Trump on the phone, on their hotline, and said, "I need a favor." What was the favor? The favor was for us, the United States, to cut some slack to ZTE, big communist business. We'd already fined them $1.5 billion. They agreed to change their board of directors, and we've notified them that one more slip, and they'd be cut off and probably forced into bankruptcy by our trade policies. But the president of China called Trump and asked him for a favor. This was at the same time that the president of China was guiding Kim prior to the Singapore deal. And Trump was criticized, of course, for doing it. But you see, you don't get the whole picture until something like that's pointed out. It's not all that complicated. Kim came to the table because Trump forced him to. North Korea was made to understand quite thoroughly and clearly that its grandstanding with nukes was over. Being clear was the first step to success. Trump has no toleration for a nuclear Korea, period. When communicated forcefully, through actions, not words, that was the game changer. Trump reversed Kim's motivation 100%. Kim thought the nukes were his ticket to security. Trump showed him the nukes are his ticket to oblivion. That's why there's reason for optimism that this is not going to be the useless nuclear diplomacy we've had since Clinton. Kim was shown that he had two choices: give up or be destroyed. His only question was how North Korea was going to be destroyed. Could be slowly through devastating economic sanctions, and we got more of them for him if he wants to back up. Or suddenly it could be by U.S. military might. The timetable would be chosen by President Trump. Trump chose to talk instead of fight. But it was going to be one or the other. Trump won because of certain New Yorker traits that he has in abundance. Not accepting BS, not caring what other people think, not being afraid of a fight. Well, the critics howled. Trump became more and more menacing. That ranged from nuclear offensive name-calling to military exercises in the Pacific. This was not a Twitter war, folks. It was real war. It was almost exactly a year ago since Trump sent the third carrier group into the Western Pacific. It said that when the U.S. sends one or two carriers, it's a show of strength. Sending out a third carrier means war. Kim had never before received that message. Past presidents put economic sanctions on Korea, kinda, sorta, only so far as China allowed, which was just far enough to keep Korea misbehaving. Trump doesn't do kinda, sorta. For the first time, we enforced sanctions against Korea. All it took was a backbones to stand up to China, and that was another Trump first. Of course, with some negotiating, too, as we mentioned. Chinese president called Trump just prior to all this and asked for a personal favor. I'm glad our president listened, aren't you? The Chinese central bank sent out messages to obey U.S. sanctions on North Korea. Funds propping up North Korea economy were shut off. Showing Trump's mastery of standard diplomacy as well, we knuckled China to get on board with a U.S.-drafted UN Security Council resolution that required member states to inspect and impound any vessel in their port breaking sanctions on North Korea. That resolution passed unanimously. With this infusion of backbone, South Korea was empowered. When it caught a Hong Kong flagged tanker violating the oil embargo, the tanker was confiscated. China was silent. Well, Kim was facing ruin, sure ruin with nuclear weapons, the possibility of survival if he gives them up. He asked for a meeting with President Trump to discuss it. Trump agreed from a position of strength. No goodwill lessening of sanctions, no decreased U.S. military presence, and the goal was total denuclearization with inspections by the U.S. That was already a huge improvement on past diplomatic successes. The only gesture our president offered was to be gracious about a meeting, as long as Kim behaved. There was one major stumbling block remaining. That was a holdover from the diplomacy of the past administration, the haunting example of Libya. The Obama-Clinton geniuses broke the agreement we made with Gaddafi to leave him alone if he gave up his weapons. Obama's decision to depose Gaddafi makes it almost impossible for any dictator to trust us and negotiate denuclearization. Vice President Pence turned the lesson around by telling Kim if he didn't agree to no nukes, he'd have the same fate as Gaddafi. Kim immediately retaliated, calling our vice president a political dummy, unbridled and impudent, and threatening us with a nuclear showdown. Big mistake. The U.S. does not have to blink at threats from a squirt like North Korea. Our expert they don't know that, but Trump does. He called off the meeting. He made it clear the U.S. would not tolerate threats from Rocket Man. Trump did not accept a reciprocal relationship. Kim cannot be rude or make threats. We can. Trump was his usual blunt self. You talk about nuclear capabilities, but ours are so massive and powerful that I pray to God they'll never have to be used. That's a quote from Donald Trump. That is what tough looks like. That's how a responsible president behaves when he sees a small country threatening international stability and the safety of our own nation. That's what happens when a president understands we are a powerful country and how to use that power. Americans, that's how you win. Big surprise, wasn't it? Well, I understand that we did offer a treaty which would take approval by the United States Congress, because you see, a treaty is something permanent. An executive action can be changed. Fortunately, much of what Obama did was by executive action, so another president comes in like Trump, and he can put in his own executive actions to get rid of the ones before. But a treaty is different. Presidents change. Treaties don't. Same time that Trump was doing this, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made it a point that he thought that the North Korea deal ought to come to Congress, and we were promising that to Kim at the time of the negotiations. There'd be widespread interest in Congress for having involvement, the Kentucky Republican told reporters at the Capitol, a quote, "If the president can reach a significant agreement with North Korea, I hope it takes the form of a treaty," he said, end quote. The majority said precedent existed for the White House reaching an agreement without a treaty, but the eventual route officials take will be up to them. But I do believe they'll need to come to Congress in some form. Another quote from McConnell. Donald Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Un signed an agreement during their summit in Singapore that committed the U.S. to unspecified, quote, security guarantees, end quote, in exchange for complete denuclearization. Again, by this going to the U.S. Senate, this will make it a permanent fixture. And I'm sure that Kim feels much more secure with that. No more Gaddafi action. Well, from the other side, the nut gallery, of course, during this whole thing, Senate Democrat leader Schumer says that it was the in-price Trump-North Korea agreement, and it was very worrisome. Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer faulted Donald Trump's agreement with North Korea Kim Un Tuesday as short on details, saying Trump gave up substantial leverage in ongoing talks over Pyongyang's nuclear program. Some Republican lawmakers and Trump administration officials have said any agreement with North Korea would be submitted as a treaty needing approval by two-thirds of the Senate. That means to get significant support from Schumer's fellow Democrats if it's going to be enacted. Well, personally, I agree with that, folks. That's what Trump wanted. It's what we promised the North Korean dictator. We're all on the same page, except Schumer thinks that, well, nobody confided in him and gave him any details. I wonder why. Pompeo notes that North Korea are going to have to denuke before any relief from the sanctions. The United States and its Asian allies worked Thursday, following the signing, to paper over any semblance of disagreement between President Donald Trump's concession to Kim that the U.S. will halt military exercises with South Korea, with Trump's top diplomat insisting that the president hadn't backed down from his firm line on North Korean nukes. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, meeting with top South Korean and Japanese diplomats, put a more somber spin on several moves by Trump after his summit with Kim that had fueled unease in Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. He said Trump's curious claim that the North nuclear threat was over was issued with, quote, eyes wide open, end quote, and brushed off a North Korean state-run media report suggesting Trump would grant concessions even before the North fully rids itself of nuclear weapons. A quote from Pompeo, "We're going to get denuclearization." He said this in the South Korean capital. And he added, only then will there be relief from the sanctions. Pompeo flew from Seoul to China's capital, Beijing, later Thursday for a meeting with the Chinese president. Again, China is believed to yield considerable influence over North Korea, their chief ally and economic pipeline. Pompeo was also due to meet with some top diplomats and hold a news conference with the Foreign Exchange Ministry in China. At a daily briefing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman reiterated China's support for a political settlement, while also to an eventual lifting of the United Nations Security Council economic sanctions. He said, quote, "We believe that the sanctions themselves are not the end," end quote. China's been praised by Trump for ramping up an economic pressure on North Korea that U.S. believes helped coax Kim to the negotiating table. See how it all comes together, folks? But you don't announce it to the press on what you might want to do down the road. Trump understood it. Schumer doesn't. But he's not too knowledgeable anyway, is he? On the joint U.S.-South Korea drills that Trump, after meeting Kim, said would be terminated, Pompeo emphasized a key caveat. If the North Korean leader stops negotiating in good faith, he said, the war games will be back on. The words of reassurance from Pompeo came as diplomacy continued at an intense pace after Tuesday's summit in Singapore. That was the first meeting again, folks, between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korea leader in 6 decades of hostility, over 60 years. At the village along the North-South Korea border, the rival Koreas on Thursday held their first high-level military talks since 2007. These were focused on reducing tensions across the heavily fortified border. Well, Pompeo had some explaining to do as he traveled to Seoul to brief the allies on what transpired in Singapore. In public, at least, South Korea leader cast the summit's outcome as positive during a short meeting with Pompeo at the Blue House, that's South Korea's presidential palace. President Moon, South Korea, an avid supporter of engagement with North Korea, called it a truly historical feat and had moved us from an area of hostility toward an era of dialogue, of peace and prosperity. Once again, listeners, remember, it's 35 miles from Seoul to the DMZ, that border that separates North and South Korea. The summit in Singapore did mark a reduction in tensions, a sea change from last fall when North Korea was conducting nuclear tests and missile tests, and Trump and Kim were trading threats and insults as strokes of the fears of war. Kim's now promising to work toward that denuclearized Korean peninsula, and state media heralded the meeting as victorious, with photos of Kim standing side by side with Trump on the world stage as it splashed across the newspapers of North Korea. Big deal, folks, but he got criticized for the photos. That's right. Guess we could have started nuking each other. On Thursday, North Koreans finally got a glimpse of video of Trump and Kim together as official North Korean television broadcast the first footage of Kim's trip to Singapore. Trump became equally ecstatic. When he landed Wednesday in Washington following the summit, he declared on Twitter that America, quote, "America and the world can sleep well tonight," end quote. With the Trump-Kim summit concluded, the baton was being passed to lower-level U.S. and North Korean officials. Pompeo said these would likely resume meeting as early as next week to hash out details of a disarmament deal, sure to be a complex and contentious process. But he said the U.S. was hopeful North Korea would take major disarmament steps before the end of Trump's first term in office, concluding January 2021. In the brief four-point joint statement signed at the summit, North Korea committed, quote, to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Kind of an overall view on just what was happening over there. 10 positives from the Trump-Kim summit. After the professionals have analyzed and criticized the results, let's look at some of the positives. Here's a summary of the main portion of the four-part deal. 1. The United States and North Korea commit to establish new U.S.-Korea relations in accordance with the desire of the peoples of the two countries for peace and prosperity. Number 2. The United States and Korea will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the South Korean peninsula. 3. Reaffirming the April 27, 2018 North Korea declaration, the North Korea commits to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. 4. The United States and North Korea commit to recovering the POW MIA remains, including the immediate repatriation of those already identified. First, he shook hands with the evil dictator. That's a positive. Yep. What else was he supposed to do? Well, he couldn't extend his hand. He could pull it back, go back and forth like a 12-year-old might be, but that's kind of slow. He did the right thing. He shook his hands. But Trump got criticized. Second, he met with Kim for a photo op under the balcony of the Colonnade at the hotel. He was right to do that, too. He had to treat the evil dictator with a minimum of respect. He could not very easily walk in through a side door. The goal is to get a good deal for America and the allies in the region. To do that would have been unwise to insult Kim. But boy, he was criticized for it. Then he helped a dazed and confused Mr. Kim walk through the right door after the photo video op under the colonnade. Mr. Kim did not know exactly where to go, and Trump held his arm out to indicate that they should both turn to the door. Turn right. Clearly, Mr. Kim, living a sheltered life for some 26 years, was out of his depth. Mr. Trump was savvy enough to see it and lend a guiding hand in such a small thing. This portended a victory for Trump in the larger deal and in future negotiations. Well, getting back, fourth, he praised the evil dictator for his willingness to sign the deal. Critics say he praised Kim too much. Again, let's criticize Trump. Very talented man, he said in the press conference. The context was that Mr. Trump was happy Mr. Kim was forward enough thinking to sign the deal in the first place. Trump declared at the press conference that he said Mr. Kim was not a nice guy, and that's a signal he acknowledged the abuses and devastation. Yes, he could have held back a little, but Trump doesn't do holding back very well. Let's focus on results and policies. I've stopped worrying about the president's gotcha social skills and his inability to raise to President Lincoln's restrained and wonderful rhetoric. In one assessment, even Mr. Trump has improved relative to the old Trump when he first declared to run back in June of 15. Getting back to our 10 summary items, number 5, we can work on bringing our soldiers and Marines back from another war, back home. That's pretty important to the families of the forgotten war. Remember, the longest war in U.S. history. 6, the agreement goes on to say the United States and Korea commit to hold follow-up negotiations. Thus, the negotiations are ongoing. We should not expect a final deal right now. Discussions for the moment are the best way toward a substantial peace. 7th, the U.S. did not lose anything substantial in the deal. As Trump pointed out, the U.S. did not have to turn over $150 billion as it did with the Iran deal. No special jet loaded with cash, $150 billion of it to get a deal. So if the North Koreans don't follow through with their commitment, and they may not, then we can either drop the whole thing or keep going on with negotiations. 8th, Mr. Trump showed a video on the beauty of capitalism and reinforced the notion in his press conference that North Korea has beautiful beaches. What's wrong with an extra big carrot? China's discovering, albeit in a limited way, that the free market capitalism provides prosperity. A great approach without apologies. 9th, in the press conference, Mr. Trump did not absolutely guarantee that the U.S. will stop the war games or military exercises. We're going to be stopping the war games, he said, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, more criticism, unless and until we see the future negotiations are not going along like they should. End quote from Donald Trump. We still maintain sanctions, and we still have the war games ready to go. Conditions apply. 10th, let's face it, America and the rest of the world are better off after the summit and the agreement than before those things. Our choice again, folks, war or talking. I'm personally kind of a militant guy, but I'm sure glad we can at least think about talking our way to peace. Mr. Kim and the deep state behind him may have indeed backed away from a verifiable and irreversible change and denuclearization. Even here, Mr. Trump acknowledged that he may have to admit later that he miscalculated. Certainly, it can go off the rails. But millions and millions of South Korean Christians have been praying for this time to be shared in their shared history. Let's keep the positives going all the way to North Korea tearing down the wall, to echo President Reagan's words. It'd be nice if the left and the Trump haters would settle down and quit criticizing our president for everything he does. But fellow listeners, that's really too much to ask. Too much to ask, folks. Too much to ask. Wanted to take this time with you. Did you stop and think, in spite of all of the criticism that our president has had, the forces of hell have come against him. All the Democrats, a lot of Republicans, the never-Trumpers, certainly the press, but he's carried the torch. Almost like it's superhuman, isn't it, folks? Almost. But then could it really be? Could it really be superhuman? I think it is. Because I think that God is on our president's side. And you know, if you're on the same side with God, he's got a pretty good shot of winning. Let's keep our president in prayer. Let's remember him, the vice president. Give them wisdom. Certainly give them physical protection. Because I'm here to tell you, and we'll cover this another day, the globalists are out to get him. They've tried everything possible to keep him from being in the White House and from staying in the White House. More drastic means could come about. Pray for God's hand on our president and his personal safety.